Welcome to the Object-Oriented UX podcast, a podcast about tackling complexity head-on, gracefully organizing massive amounts of information, facilitating cross-functional collaboration like a boss, iterating strategically and designing scalable, future-proof, and of course, naturally intuitive object-oriented user experiences. An OUXer is a powerful blend of information architect, business analyst, and UX strategist. If this sounds like you or what you aspire to, you are so in the right place. I'm Sophia, user experience designer and chief evangelist for object-oriented UX. I've taught OUX to companies big and small and to thousands of individual designers like you, and I am honored to be your host. What's up, OUXers? If you have no idea what object-oriented UX is and you're just curious about it, you're in the right place. Or if you've been practicing OUX for a while and need a good refresher, you're also in the right place. Especially if you've been practicing OUX based on an article I wrote in 2015 on a list apart. So in this first episode of the OUX podcast, I will be revisiting that article and reading you sort of an updated version of it. So my process for practicing OUX has evolved quite a bit in the last 5 years. It's been my obsession for the past 5 years and also my livelihood, practicing it with clients and teaching it at conferences and within design teams. So I guess it would be pretty weird if it hadn't significantly evolved, right? So if you found value in that 2015 article, awesome. But you were about to see how much the process has matured and how the core concepts have actually stayed the same. So as I read, I'll be sort of moving a few things around and doing some ad-lib updates. And the good news, though, is everything in that article I actually still agree with. So if that's been a foundational piece of your design process, which so many designers have told me, which is awesome, it's not like things are completely changing. It's more that they're just evolving. So it's really just that I'm going to be changing some words around, some like labels, things like I don't call them elements anymore. I call them attributes. So things like that will be moving around, and some important sequencing actually. So the order of operations has changed. And then just some things I'll be elaborating on too. Okay, so let's jump in. In June 2012, while working at CNN.com, I was tasked with designing the user experience of election night. So that was Obama's second election. The next 5 months of my life would be dedicated to that one night. But success for me had nothing to do with who won. It kind of did, not professionally, but professionally, success to me had nothing to do with who won. I was concerned with findability and data visualization and this shape-shifting canvas of something called responsive design and how the hell mouse over flyouts was going to work on an iPhone. So for the first time in history, CNN.com was releasing a responsive experience. And for the first time in history, I was going to design a responsive experience. And just for a little bit of zoom out context here, so this is 2012. We were the only news outlet to release a responsive design, and CNN.com itself, the actual website proper, did not go fully responsive until 2015. So kind of think back, like this was very cutting edge in 2012. And the stakes were very high. So election night is like Super Bowl Sunday for CNN.com. If well executed, it's one of the highest revenue nights in a 4-year cycle. To add to that pressure, we were on a very tight timeline with a deadline that wasn't going to budge. So we were going to release on November 6th, right? The election was not going to wait on us to do a little bit more QA. So then I learned that the first development sprint kicked off in 4 days. So I basically got pulled in this project as the only UX designer in this project. And then I get put this opportunity gets put in my lap. I'm super excited about it. And then I get told, by the way, development needs to start on Monday. I still remember it was a Thursday and development was going to start on Monday. And I'm like, I need to go and Wikipedia how elections work. Like, I was not a very political person then. I'm still really not. But I was like, I don't really know the difference between the House and the Senate, which is terrible. Okay. In retrospect, it's terrible. But I seriously, like, this is how I was just coming into this. And I didn't have any time for research, much less, I didn't have time for design, much less research, right? So this was a Thursday, and developers needed something to work off of by Monday. And so I kind of freaked out, and my project manager just kind of calmly told me, like, don't worry, calm down. The dev team only needs one template for the first sprint. So while they're building that first template, you can move on to the next template. So the entire sprint schedule had already been laid out, and had been laid out by the templates from 2008. So they looked at the 2008 design, which was not responsive, and they said, okay, we have a state detailed template like California, Kansas, Georgia. We have a race template. We have a state race detailed template. And then there was about 8 other templates. And they basically designed the sprints by the templates. And so they told me, you know what, we only need this one piece. And then, we're going to be very iterative about this, right? And I wonder how many of you have been asked to iterate, I'm using air quotes right now, iterate in this way, right? Where you're asked to design a cog in a machine without thinking about the whole machine. So just design this cog, and then you can design the next cog. And then you can design the next cog. And you know what that turns out to be is not a very well-oiled machine, or not a very well-designed machine. So this is really how I'd worked in the past before too. So thinking myopically worked okay when we were designing in pages on fixed screen sizes. And we could sort of get away with quilting the pieces together that are just sort of designed in silos. And at this time, I was pretty clueless about responsive design, but I did know that we needed a clean and simple system, not a bunch of pages strung together. I kind of intuitively knew that about responsive design, because as all engineers and designers know, the more moving parts in a system, the more opportunities for disaster. The more moving parts, the more likely it is to break. So for those first 4 days, I did not design one wireframe, just one disconnected template. Instead, I blocked out this holistic system made of reusable and interchangeable parts. So in the article, there's actually a picture of this original diagram. So you can, of course, I'm going to link to the original article in the show notes. But basically, it is one piece of paper that shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screens, just 5 screens. I think like an overlay too, so like 5.5 screens, all on one page, super low fidelity, and it's showing how all these pages link through the content. So it's showing, this is basically my first contextual navigation, which we'll be talking a whole lot about on this podcast. So I presented this diagram to a conference room of stakeholders who expected to review a single finished template, like completely finished. And I demonstrated, though, that I had reduced the number of components and templates compared to the 2008 design, and that this new system was simple enough to fit on one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And thankfully, a critical mass of people in the room saw the value of what I presented, which was really less stuff to build. So in a way, I had simplified without dumbing down. So we were still showing all the same data. We were still showing all the same information. It was just way fewer moving parts by thinking holistically in the front end instead of thinking like cog by cog. So this diagram that I churned out in 2012, it was far from perfect. Mostly in that when I look back on it, I was trying to do too much too soon. So I was jumping the gun on implementation. I was already blocking out these flyouts and these bar graphs. I was definitely still thinking desktop first. I was worrying about positioning as opposed to prioritization. And I packed in a premature homepage, which I consider like a cover sheet of the experience, which now in my process, I design the homepage last. And I also was taking a stab at persistent top-level navigation instead of just focusing on the content first. So although this diagram was very imperfect, the spirit of the diagram and the thinking behind it really hit a chord with me. So this wasn't a sitemap. It didn't show hierarchy, and it wasn't a storyboard. It didn't block out a task flow. Instead, this diagram mapped out a system of things. And it changed the way I did UX. Like if I can describe any pivotal moment, it was probably these few days, these 4 days where I realized that like I couldn't design these cogs in a machine. I needed to design the entire machine at a really high level, but dig down into the details, not in interaction design fidelity, but in content and data fidelity. Okay, so if we strip away the interaction design that I did in that original diagram and the persistent navigation and the homepage and all like these little layout decisions that I was making way too soon, here's a diagram that I would have created then if I knew what I know now, showing the system of these 3 objects. So in the article, I show the picture of it, but basically this is 3 templates, a state template, for like example, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, a race template, so example, the Senate, a particular House of Representatives, or the presidency, that would be considered a race. And then a state race results. So for example, the Tennessee Senate or the Tennessee outcomes for the presidency. And so on the state page, I basically have a little black box for a description of the state if it's a battleground state. No descriptions needed if it's not a battleground state. And then I have these content cards or content modules. So for each individual state race result. So we have the presidential, the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the gubernatorial, if that's applicable. And then we have another template for race. So we have a little summary graphic on the top. And then we have the state race result modules. So battleground states, and then all the states. And then we have state race results. So basically the state template and the race template leads to the state race results. And if that doesn't make sense, go check out the visual. That'll help a whole lot. So this methodology worked. Our responsive election night turned out to be that Super Bowl Sunday that the CNN executives had hoped for. And we really did do it by the skin of our teeth. So working late nights and weekends to make sure the design performed on all of the devices. And if that design had been any more complex, I don't know if we could have pulled it off. So you have to think about, as a UX designer, any kind of complexity that you bake in, any extraneous complexity that you bake in, it compounds. So if you design 2 elements where you could have just had 1 element there, then development has to develop those 2 elements, and QA now has to QA those 2 elements. So it really does create this snowball effect of extra complexity. So you want, like very early in the process, you want to create this really clean, simple system that doesn't have a whole lot of extraneous complexity baked in, which is what this process by and large helps do. That's one of the biggest advantages of going objects first. Okay, so today I've really evolved this trial by fire experience into this proven, structured, object-based process that I now call ORCA. So ORCA stands for Objects, Relationships, Calls to Action, and Attributes. And on this podcast today, I'm going to introduce you to object-oriented UX. I'm going to share my process for object mapping, which really just scratches the surface of this now much more mature, full ORCA process. But object mapping is a really great place to start. And even though the process has evolved in the past 5 years, object mapping is still this juicy core center to the ORCA process. Okay, before we get into that, let's talk about mobile first and content first and object first approaches. So when Luke Wroblewski first wrote about mobile first in 2011, I was still firmly rooted in beginning my sketching process. And to be honest, my design process was sketching out desktop layouts. And it took me about a year. So even after the first election, that election experience where that first diagram was very much desktop layout, it took me about a year after that to really retrain myself to think mobile first. And today, I do mobile first design. Even when I'm designing something that's like desktop only software application, I'll do my first iteration in sort of this quote unquote mobile first way. So to me, mobile first simply means forced prioritization. It means thinking about layout later on and starting with a single column, air quotes, design also basically known as a list, to force yourself to prioritize content and functionality and metadata with this sequential ranking. So you're waiting to think about layout. Like, does this thing go on the left or does this thing go on the right? Force yourself to prioritize. So this approach nicely dovetails with the concept of content first. So this content out design as opposed to canvas in design that Jeremy Keith also wrote about in 2011, way before his time, way before my time. I wasn't thinking about this at all in 2011, and the fact that Luke Wroblewski and Jeremy Keith and so many other people were, Sarah Watcher-Boetcher as well, in her 2013 book, Content Everywhere. If you have not read that, please read that. I didn't read it until like 2015 or 2016, and I was like, I cannot believe she was thinking about this. I mean, I guess she was writing it probably in 2011. So a lot of people were thinking about this stuff in 2011, and I got to it 2012, 2013, sort of forced through the crucible of responsive design. So anyway, the basic idea that Jeremy Keith was proposing is that you have to know what you're saying before you can actually prioritize it and lay it all out. So sometimes this means actually having real deal copy first, particularly if you're working with a site that has a critical mass of evergreen or instructional copy or marketing copy that needs to be organized and prioritized and analyzed and updated before design work begins. But if you're working on a site that is 99% instantiated objects, so think like news articles, products, campaigns, donation, like think about products in the Amazon catalog. There's no way you're going to build a copy deck up front or ever. You're never going to go through a content analysis of every single Amazon product. So instead of prioritizing actual copy, you're going to want to think in objects. So what I often say are the cookie cutter. So if every single product instance is a cookie, we want to design a really great cookie cutter to stamp out all those cookies. Okay, so that's what I mean by instantiated objects, instances of the object. So we design a great template or cookie cutter for our news article that can then push out millions of instances of news articles. So that's OOUX. Putting object design before procedural action design and thinking about a system through the lens of real-world objects and a user's mental model, not digital world actions. So real-world objects in a user's mental model, those products, tutorials, locations. And when I say not digital world actions like search and filter and compare and check out, we're going to think about those things later. We're going to think about our objects first. What are those things in the mental model and also in the business process model? And so we determine the actions after we define the objects, as opposed to this traditional actions first process that jumps us straight into flows and user stories and interactions and features and what does the user need to do within the system. First, we define what are the objects in the system that the user is doing the things to. Okay, so just a little more of an aside. I've been going quite a bit off script here, but even more of an aside. My current definition of OOUX is the following. It is a philosophy for designing digital systems that respects the fact that people think in objects. So think of OOUX as this philosophy. And ORCA, that I'm going to be talking to you about, is my particular process. So you might come up with your own process for designing object-orientedly, or you might take the ORCA process and evolve it further. Let's talk about that. I would love to hear how that goes for you, but I just want to differentiate those two. So think about OOUX as this philosophy for designing objects first, respecting the fact that people think in objects, and ORCA is the process with all the color-coded stickies and all that good stuff. So when I say OOUX is a philosophy for designing digital systems that respects the fact that people think in objects, you might be thinking, do people think in objects? And the answer is yes. Definitively, yes. So there's a ton of super interesting psychological research that backs this up that we're not going to be getting into today. And that I, to be honest, hadn't started exploring in 2015. So we're going to be getting into it in definitely in future episodes. But right now I'm about to talk to you about the parallel with OOUX and object-oriented programming. But here's the truth. So even if developers didn't use OO languages, and some of them are moving to non-object-oriented languages, that's cool. I would still 100% and 10% be still advocating for object-oriented UX, because humans, your users, think in objects. And like I said, we're going to geek out on all that cognitive science backup for in future episodes of the podcast. If you're really interested in digging into it now, go check me out on Medium. I have a lot of articles on this, so it's Sophia VUX on Medium. But just know this, the added alignment with developers is icing on the cake bonus for the real reason we should be designing experiences that are object-oriented. It's that it's better for our users. And it truly helps us create these naturally intuitive user experiences. Okay, let's go back to the script. So, object-oriented programming. So, object-oriented programming. This is how your back-end engineers work. In the 1980s, the software engineering community began to transition from procedural languages to object-oriented languages. It was quite the revolution. And this had lots of benefits like code reuse, so they could actually encapsulate data and play with other parts of the system without having to worry about this sort of spider web effect of like, oh, I changed this over here and it's going to have this ripple effect of changing all these other things. They could encapsulate objects and just work on that object. So this was not only helped with collaboration, one developer could work on one object, another developer could work on another object, and then they could figure out how those objects communicate. This actually not only ended up in better collaboration and development, but also maintenance as well, and being able to grow the software. So still today, most programmers will bring your designs to life using object-oriented languages. And most technical architects, as they start planning out this work, are going to begin their process by mapping out the objects that make up the problem domain. So they'll use something called UML, entity relationship modeling, to figure out, kind of plan out these relational databases. So when they look at your wireframes or prototypes that are very action-oriented or task-oriented, they basically have to reverse engineer your design to parse out the objects. So they're going to be thinking, how will object X talk to object Y, and will object A be made up of a lot of little object Bs, and which attributes will each object have? Will this class of objects inherit from this other class of objects? So these are the kind of things that they're looking at within a procedural wireframe. So our industry develops object-orientedly, but by and large still designs procedurally, focusing on these like drill-down hierarchies and linear task flows. But there's another option. So in his 1995 book, way back, all right, this book is called Designing Object-Oriented User Interfaces. And designer and engineer Dave Collins, the author, he argues that basing both front-end and back-end design on object-oriented principles, quote, brings coherence to the software development process. Object orientation reveals deep structural correspondences between the artifacts of analysis, design, and implementation. Yes, sir. And I would actually still highly recommend this book. It's quite a bit of a textbook. You can still get on Amazon. I think you can get used copies on Amazon. So defining objects that mimic the mental model of your users, it provides this scaffolding for team communication, actually. It gives you a shared language. So on top of team cohesion between the designer and the developer, you're actually getting much better cohesion between designer business. So you can bring in developers and business and designers all together to get this shared language around the user's mental model. So here's just some other benefits. So matching your user's mental model, of course, is going to improve the experience, but ensuring this type of simplicity where you're thinking the way that I did with the election results by really reducing any extraneous accidental complexity. So this process actually helps reduce those extraneous design elements, what I call shapeshifters, and which we're going to talk a whole lot about later in the podcast, and trying to get better on YouTube because a lot of this stuff is pretty visual, but definitely go check me out on YouTube. I think you can just Google OOUX and find me. Google, search, and YouTube. I'll have more examples of shapeshifters and really show how this extraneous complexity comes to life. So please subscribe to me on YouTube. I will put a link in the show notes. And also it helps you grow and maintain your product. So objects can be iterated on without affecting the rest of the system. In a very similar way that object-oriented programming can do this as well. It helps with object-oriented design as well. So new objects can be sort of gracefully folded in as opposed to tacking on features, which turns into this sort of Frankenstein design. This also helps you build better APIs because you have these portable independent objects, and you get lots of nice SEO brownie points for having structured content and all of this valuable cross-linking. So how all the objects basically lead to each other. The content is the navigation, which we'll be talking about with nested objects in just a moment. And that brings me to my very favorite justification that OOUX helps you bake in this contextual navigation that is actually more crucial than ever the way that people are looking at their experiences on their mobile devices. So it helps users get to content through the content. And this is important because that persistent navigation might be hidden. It might be hamburgered away out of sight when a user is on a small screen. And we have crazy data how little people actually click on that hamburger. You might think it's a normal thing to click on it, but a lot of people, there's like, oh God, I surveyed people, I think it was like a year and a half ago, but not that long ago. And it was like 30% of people, and this is from my network too, which is a highly elder millennial technology slanting group of people from my Facebook and my Twitter, and I had about 100 people fill out the survey, and it was like 25 or 30% didn't know what that hamburger icon meant. And about 60% of people were like, sometimes I click on it, sometimes I don't click on it. So we really can't trust that people are going to go into that hamburger. We need a better way for people to navigate. So, and even if you're on like this 17-inch monitor and you have this most beautiful pen to the top navigation, it still seems to get ignored a whole lot. So when users visit a site for the first time, they really gravitate to those big, shiny objects. And using the navigation is sort of like a backup plan. So Val Jinks, in another survey that I did this was probably 2014 or so, I did another survey, and one of the respondents who is a UX designer, Val Jinks, she neatly summed it up. She said, we go to the content on the page first. The top navigation is the fire escape. So if you take anything away from this, start thinking about your top navigation as plan B, your fire escape, and your main navigation, your primary navigation should be through the content, through the relationships. So those real world relationships from object to object. So an example of this would be if a teacher is looking at an application, she's going to see students and she's going to see classes. And there's a very clear relationship between that. So a class has many students, a student has many classes. And that real world relationship in her mental model needs to be reflected in the design. So if she's on a class detail page, she can see all of her students, she can click to a student and then see all the classes that the student is in. Click to another class, again, see all the students, okay? So we want to reflect those real world relationships within our navigation. That's what I call contextual navigation. So another example, if a user is reading a recipe, where might they want to go next? So we should anticipate how they might want to explore based on the recipe they're reading and not leave it up to them to sort of peck through a hierarchical menu. And we certainly just shouldn't leave them with a few related recipes and consider our work done. Like, you're looking at this recipe, here's some other recipes. So what if they want to see the chef, more details about the person that created this recipe and maybe their recipes? Or maybe they want to see other recipes that use Swiss chard, for example, so pivoting on ingredient. So if we're thinking object-orientedly, we're going to experiment with ways that each of the objects might relate to other objects and really look beyond the obvious. So maybe chefs have favorite ingredients. So in an object-oriented design, I have a diagram in the article that you can check out. A user can continually explore instances of these three objects in this design. So we have recipe, chef, and ingredient. So we identify the objects. And we don't want the user to ever hit a dead end. So the content is the navigation. So in this example, we have the ingredient. We have the description of the ingredient, maybe some tips, and then we have all the recipes that use that ingredient. And then we might have chefs who love using this ingredient. And then we might even have substitute ingredients. Okay, and then from chefs that love this ingredient, we can click on that chef. We go over to the chef detail page. We see their pictures, some little bio content, and then we see all their recipes. And what else do we see? We see their favorite ingredients, and we might even see similar chefs. And then we can click on the recipe. We, of course, see the chef that created that recipe. We see all the ingredients. All those ingredients have been objectified. So I can click back to the ingredient detail page. Okay, and I never have to click any top navigation. So if this concept feels familiar, you've probably read about or practiced content modeling. And in the past 5 years, many information architects, and so this past 5 years, this was written in 2015, so past 10 years. So for a while, let's just say for a while, many information architects, particularly I love Mike Atherton's work and Rachel Lovinger's work, they have started focusing on systems of reusable content types and becoming more involved in the design of content management systems. So thinking about the content creator and not just the end user. And I already mentioned Sarah Watcher-Boetcher, her book Content Everywhere. She really encourages us to model our content before diving into wireframes and interaction design. So she says, content modeling gives you systematic knowledge. It allows you to see what other types of content you have, which elements they include, and how they operate in a standardized way. So unfortunately, though, the art of content modeling is still unfamiliar to many UX designers who hear content and sometimes assume it doesn't apply to them. This is especially true for UXers who deal with software as a service or product design. Strategies that involve quote-unquote content sometimes fall on deaf ears. They think like that's not the thing that I need to be doing. And conversely, I'll add to this, a lot of content strategists are focusing on the very content-y type things like the FAQs, marketing copy, articles, and not necessarily thinking about how their work as a content strategist could apply to software as a service for actually structuring these objects in the user's real world mental model. So it kind of goes both ways. I think that content modeling has been siloed in the content strategy world, and UXers aren't using it enough. And even content strategists are using content modeling just for the really content-y type objects and not things like I use the example a lot of the time with a project that I worked on for that built software for used car dealerships. And I give the example of like a vehicle. Like a content strategist might not think of a vehicle as content. This is an instantiated piece of content. And definitely the end user, the used car salesman does not think of a vehicle as content. It's a thing like in their parking lot at a certain dealership location. If they have multiple dealerships, a dealership is a thing within their mental model. It's not a piece of content. Okay, so going off on a tangent, let's get back to object mapping. So object mapping, the core of my process behind OOUX, is basically content modeling for designers who don't deal with content in the traditional sense, but still need to design systems and not just systems of implementation. And when I say systems of implementation, I wasn't using the term in 2015, but this is your design system. Okay, so that is your system of representing your objects, your calendar pickers, your homepage sliders, your search bars, your drop downs. That is all the stuff of implementation and representation of objects. So I'm a broken record when I say your users are not coming to your site for your calendar picker. They're coming for the event. So we want to define that an event is the thing that they're coming for, and there's people that go to the event, and there's venues that events happen at, and we want to define all of those things before we design all the bits and pieces that are used to digitally, visually represent those things. So we want to design the stuff first, the stuff of value, before we design the packaging for it. The packaging is very, very important. It needs to be on brand, it needs to be ergonomic, but it doesn't need to happen first. First, we need to come up with what is the real deal substance, and then we come up with great packaging for it. Okay, so while this tight collection of your reusable components and templates, this is, like I said, invaluable. Design systems are so important. Those patterns don't hold meaning for a user unless they're backed by a system of real-world objects that matches their mental model. So focus first on designing that system of real-world objects, then design the system of implementation to bring it to life. Okay, so this is the linchpin of all my design work because it transforms goals into an executable system to meet those goals. Okay, so let's talk through the process here. Extracting, how do we extract objects from goals? Or more recently, I've actually been saying, how do we extract objects from our research? Okay, so our goals should be derived from the research, and we can actually pull our objects from our goals as well as our research. So one of my very favorite perks of object mapping is that it provides this perfect bridge from goals and research into design. So instead of sort of haphazardly whiteboarding, sort of a beautiful mind style, object mapping provides this neat framework to move from that strategy to design. So today I often say that the ORCA process belongs at the crux of the double diamond. And if you're not sure what the double diamond is, do a Google image search of it right now. So ORCA belongs right in between that research and discovery diamond and the other diamond of designing and testing. So it's really this process to take the goals and the research that you came up with during research and discovery and convert it into structure, convert it into information architecture for design to be very firmly based on. So after you get into design, please continue to go all John Nash on the whiteboard, get really creative, but do that object mapping first because it'll give that wild creativity a very solid foothold. Okay, let's go through an example. So let's say we're building an application to help home improvement brands connect to DIYers. So we've done some user interviews and a competitive analysis and discussions with stakeholders, and we have a brief. So I'm going to read you this brief. Give DIYers an outlet to post their home improvement challenges, soliciting potential solutions from product companies, brands. DIYers get expert solutions to their challenges and brands get exposure. DIYers can search and browse existing challenges, commenting on the proposed solutions. Brands can search and browse for open challenges that might be a good fit for one of their products. Brands can create solutions that feature one or more of their products. DIYers can close a challenge after a solution has been chosen and later follow up on how well the solution worked. Brands can create a library of solutions that can be reused across various challenges. Okay, so to extract the objects, basically we're going in and we're foraging for the nouns. So you'll see in the article actually like a version of me circling and highlighting and drawing lots of arrows to try to figure out what are the nouns in that brief. So feel free actually to just back up and listen to that again and see if you can figure out what you think the nouns would be. Kind of work along with me. So today, I don't only do this noun foraging on a tightly wordsmithed list of goals. So I actually, like I said before, I get my nouns directly from those interview transcripts and competitive analysis and current state audits and a litany of other sources. So I'm going to lots of different sources, even Wikipedia articles on that domain. I'll be getting nouns from there. And recognizing these nouns, this is like first grade simple. But extracting objects, it does require a little bit of some subtle art. So here's some tips. So we want to pay special attention to nouns that keep popping up, like challenge and solution in this example. Those are going to be important objects. And we're going to ignore some of those abstract nouns like exposure that describes like a fluffy concept we'll hope will emerge from our system, not a tangible object that's going to be part of our system. And we're going to ignore words like library came up because that is simply a collection of other objects, like a library of solutions. So really solutions is the object and the library is just a list of those solutions. So watch out for other words like calendar, which is really just a fancy list of events, or catalog, which is a list of products, or map, which is a visualized list of locations. Really, these are just fancy list views. So for most systems that deal with locations, we're going to have perhaps a single filterable map view. So the map is a design mechanism, not really an object itself. Okay, so that's a tricky one. We infer objects from two actions within this design brief. So in the design brief, we have commenting on and following up. So that leads us to believe that we're going to need some sort of comment or message object. And we also know that a challenge object needs multiple states. So we have posted and progress, closed, and closed with feedback. Okay, so there's definitely some nuance to this, all right? You don't just grab the nouns and say you're done with it. Okay, so from this exercise, we have the main building blocks of our system. And so what I came up with is DIYer, brand, challenge, solution, product, and question or comment, some sort of communication object. Okay, and I'm putting all of those on blue sticky notes. All right. And we're going to write each object on its own sticky note to visualize the building blocks of our system. Okay, so here is where I really break from the 2015 article, and I switch up the order of the process. So back then, I would actually jump straight from objects to attributes, which is the A of ORCA at the end of the ORCA process. So over the years of teaching and practicing OOUX, I found that it's easier to zoom in on those details of the objects after we've defined the object a little bit better. So two important ways to define our objects is through their relationships with each other and through what users want to do to those objects. So respectfully, this is the R of ORCA, is for relationships. We need to define the relationship so we can see how the objects sit in context of each other. This is how are they really defined in this particular system? It's often through how they relate to each other. Okay, context is very, very important. And the C of ORCA, the calls to action, we want to talk about those a little bit. So this is this bridge into interaction design. We're not going to get into the details of the interaction design, but we want to figure out what do users do to these objects. This is going to help us define them, and it's going to actually help us build out those attributes. So in this episode, we're really going to breeze through the C of ORCA. It really deserves its own episode. So also, if you want to see a visual update of this process, please get on my newsletter. So I'm going to be sending out a mural board and actually the mural template that shows all of this in action. So that's probably going to be in probably a week or two. So you have a little bit of time to get on the newsletter and make sure you get this visualization. And it will show this all visualized in a beautiful mural template. Okay. So you can get on the newsletter at rewiredux.com/newsletter. Okay, let's get into step 2 of the ORCA process, relationships. And this is where we nest objects for that beautiful cross-linking and contextual navigation. So first, we start out with relationships by building a rough system model, or what a developer might call an entity relationship diagram. So you can look up ERDs, do a Google image search for those, and that'll give you a good idea what a system model looks like. It's basically a model of the system. And then we start with the object mapping process by looking at our system model and transferring it into nested objects. So let's talk through that. Okay, it's probably really confusing if you're just getting into OOUX, but let's dig in. So we're going to start with one object, and we're going to consider ways that each of the other objects can nest inside that given object. So as you nest objects, you're going to be defining the relationships between them and implicitly the contextual navigation as well. And we're going to use more blue stickies. We'll get into some other colors of stickies. We're going to stick with blue stickies here as we experiment how each object might nest with its other sibling objects. So for example, let's do one of them together. So here's how the conversation might go for our challenge objects. So we're thinking about the challenge, the DIYer post to this network. So how will all of the other objects fit in? So how would DIYer fit into the challenge? So that's pretty easy. It's going to be a DIYer, or a challenge has one DIYer that is the author of that challenge. Okay, what about solution? So this is really the main nested object of a challenge. So a challenge is going to have 0 to many solutions that brands have posted to it. And we're going to show all those solutions as sort of part of that challenge. Brand. Okay, Not really. So brands are definitely going to be connected to solution, but not directly through to the challenge. So the brand and the brand is going to connect to the challenge through proxy of the solution. So brand doesn't really need to be a nested object directly on the challenge. Okay, product. So then again, this is sort of part of the solution. So the solution gets posted, and then when we get to solution, we can say, okay, a solution is going to have one-to-many products that are required for that solution. But again, the product is going to be connected to the challenge through proxy of the solution. And comment. Okay, again, probably relegated to solution. So should we keep all the commenting on the solution? Or maybe should brands and DIYers perhaps be able to pose questions directly to the challenge? So we might need to explore this one more. Okay, and then solution on the other hand, so if we're thinking about solution as what I call the host object, the main object, we can say, okay, the DIYer might not directly relate to the solution, but brand definitely will. So a solution has one brand that posted it. A solution has many products that are involved, or one to many might just be one, but probably at least one because they're basically trying to sell their products, right? And a solution might have 0 to many comments on it. So questions about the solution, actually like people trying to do the solution, and letting people know how it worked. So note that this doesn't figure out everything. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that the ORCA process is now 4 rounds. So we go through ORCA 4 times. All right, so back in 2015, I hadn't really expanded the process to these iterations, but this first round, it's all about discovery and actually coming up with more questions and answers. So the 4 rounds of ORCA, we have discovery, then we go into requirements, where we really dig into the definition of these things, we really get into the weeds, then we get into prioritization, and then we finally get into sketching and prototyping. So in this post and in this episode, we're really just talking about discovery, and that often helps expose complexity. It helps expose some of these questions that we might have that will often help us kick back to research and say, all right, we're not quite ready to go and design yet. We have this litany of questions that we need to basically go back to research. And this actually helps you sell research really well. So without going on too much of a tangent here, I hear a lot of designers complaining about not getting time and space for research. And you can't really, it's difficult to sell research just for its own sake, that research is a good thing and we should do it. If you have very high risk assumptions that have been identified that you need to go back to more research, that's going to really help you sell the research, especially if those assumptions, you've come to those collaboratively with your stakeholders. So this entire process should be done collaboratively. And as your stakeholders and the decision makers are going through this process with you and learning like, oh, wow, we still have a lot of questions on what these things are and how they actually relate, this is going to give you really great ammunition to propose additional research. Okay, back to the article. So the next step, the C of ORCA, is to brainstorm calls to action for each object, user role by user role. So for example, challenge, a DIYer, which is one user role, creates a challenge, edits a challenge, closes a challenge. Other DIYers might save or favorite a challenge. A brand representative, which is another user type within the system, is going to post solutions to the challenge. So make sure to check out that mural board, which I will be releasing in my newsletter, to see this full CTA brainstorm. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on and wrap this up by talking about attributes. This is where we define what the objects are actually made of. So we determined the macro building blocks of our system and their relationships. And now we need to determine these most granular attributes of each. So the indivisible attributes, we're looking at this like at the atomic level. So, and I shouldn't say atomic level because this is very different than atomic design. Atomic design and OOUX go together like peanut butter and jelly, but they are different things. That atomic design is that system of representation. So we're going to be looking at each individual piece of core content and metadata. So this activity is often reserved for 11th hour, very detailed design. But defining attributes while in the medium of sticky notes super early on is very liberating. So this is liberating in the way that when you start sketching later on, you can focus on the more creative aspects because you've already had all these early conversations about what makes up each object. And this is going to help you avoid moments later in the game where an important attribute, you realize it's been left off, or you find that an attribute is actually extraneous. So these changes, it's really crappy when these changes need to be made across several design documents. So if you figure all that stuff out early on, really kind of get sign off on it as a team, you're like, yes, this is what these objects are made of. Once you get into design, you sort of have that laundry list, and you can be more creative with interaction design with display. You can kind of release that brain power. So basically, I often say this is avoiding multitasking. So the way that I would work quite a bit early on is I would be doing like what I was talking about at the top of the podcast with the CNN example, is I was doing too much at one time. So this is really separating it and saying, okay, let's think about content and structure. And then once we get to design, we're going to be much better designers because we've already figured out that content and structure, and all our brain power can go into the creative aspect of design. Okay, so most importantly, you can have conversations with your team, like, should DIYers be able to add budget metadata to a challenge before your non-designers are looking at wireframe and layout? So this keeps the conversation really focused rather than them getting stuck on something like the icon for budget. So you want to have your subject matter experts and your stakeholders at the sticky note level, at the structural level. This is where they're going to be the most use to you. They're going to be much less useful to you when they're reviewing the wireframe, okay? The wireframe should just be no surprise at all because they were involved in coming up with a structure for the wireframe. They should look at the wireframe and just say, like, yeah, it looks good. All right, keep moving. That should be a very boring design review, okay? Because all this stuff was already figured out collaboratively. Okay, so at this point in the process, I separate two types of elements: core content and metadata. So core content is stuff like text and images, and that goes on yellow sticky notes. And metadata, this is any data the user might sort and filter on. I put that on red sticky notes, okay? So if your team isn't sure about a potential piece of content, even like whether it's metadata or core content, just write it down anyway, add a question mark, move on. So even as you are doing this, don't get too hung up on core content versus metadata. There's a really good reason to differentiate them, but sometimes early on it can be a little bit confusing. Is something core content? Is something metadata? So let me give some examples. So core content for a DIYer might be the name, the profile picture, a short bio. Some metadata might be the date that they joined the system. Let's do like a product. So for a product, we might have the title of the product, some images, a description. That would all be core content. And some metadata might be something like price, okay? Or numbers of DIYers who have liked this product. So popularity could also be metadata on the product. The challenge might have title, it might have multiple images, a description, potentially even video might be core content on the challenge. And then as far as metadata, we might have the date posted, potentially due date. I have a question mark there. The budget, so how much money do I have to actually solve this challenge? And maybe even time budget too. Like I want a quick and dirty solution versus like I have an entire weekend. That might also be metadata. Okay, so what I have as step 4 in this article, forced ranking, is actually an entire round of the ORCA process. It's the 3rd round. So like I mentioned, we have discovery, then we have requirements, then we have prioritization. But back in 2015, I was really just focused on prioritizing attributes. But today, we go through prioritization for objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes. So all of the pillars of ORCA get prioritized. But we're just going to go ahead and take a sneak peek on prioritizing attributes. And in future episodes, I'm going to be diving more into the entire round of prioritization. Okay, forced ranking of attributes. So this is the most diabolically difficult step, especially when you're doing this with clients and stakeholders. So in the prior steps, it's very important that you wrote each of those attributes and nested objects on separate sticky notes, because now we're going to reorder those attributes from most to least important. So this ordered list, it doesn't necessarily provide a direct representation of what's going to be at the top and the bottom of the screen. So in design, priority might manifest itself in size or color. So low priority content might actually be placed at the top of the screen, but in a collapsed panel, like with some progressive disclosure, or like in a small light gray text, so something like that. So reassure your team that we're simply prioritizing and not designing yet. And while prioritizing, imagine which elements are going to be most important to your users, which bits are must-have information and what is nice to have. And put your nice-to-have stuff near the bottom and, of course, the must-have at the top. And when considering metadata, think about the most important sorting and filtering mechanisms. So if there's going to be a default sorting of popularity, then the metadata of number of DIYers who like this might be higher priority. Okay, and as we get into this more within this podcast, we're going to be talking about ways to bring users into the prioritization process as well. So there's really cool ways that you can do this, not just with assuming what is most important and what is least important for your users, but also doing surveys with either forced ranking surveys or multiple choice surveys, and also some OOUX style card sorting, which we'll be getting into later in the podcast. Okay, let's wrap this up, right? This has been a long one. So after we've gone through this process, you now have this object-based system that's derived straight from goals, straight from research, because you did that noun foraging, okay? But keep in mind that while this activity provides a foundation for designing an implementation system and all your interactions and all your persistent nav, it doesn't carve any decisions in stone. It's a first draft, and as you iterate, objects and attributes are going to be introduced, they're going to be eliminated, they're going to be reprioritized. That's why the ORCA process has evolved to be iterative, to actually go through 4 rounds of this, and things definitely move around from round to round. So your object map provides that framework for continued conversation and collaboration with, of course, your client, your design team, and your developers. So ORCA is not a new end-to-end process, like I mentioned before. It's not going to replace how you do research. It's not even going to replace how you do interaction design. It's this new ingredient to add to your current process, that gauntlet between the research and design diamonds, right? And it's going to add clarity and simplicity and cohesion to how you design and to, of course, the products that you release into the world. So I hope you enjoyed this first episode. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. I threw a whole lot of stuff at you, but I hope you stick around for future episodes to continue learning more about object-oriented UX. I am starting the 3rd cohort of the OOUX certification program next Wednesday. That is September 30th. And I have 1 spot open, maybe 2 spots open. I need to check. So it's a small group, only about 20 people. And we're going to go through a 10-week training process. So these are 3-hour workshops every week. There's homework every week. I review the homework every single week. There's a collaborative, lively forum where everybody in past cohorts and the current cohort come together, review each other's designs. It's my life, all right? So there are a few spots open. I'm going to put a link in the show notes with I think like a $200 discount. So that gets it at a really affordable price. So especially for a 10-week live training program. So that starts September 30th and goes through December 2nd, I believe. So if this was, if you really enjoyed this episode and you want to just dive right in, go ahead and join us. Get one of those last spots. And I hope to maybe see you on September 30th. All right, you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Happy OOUXing. Thank you so much for listening. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit objectorientedux.com/podcast for show notes. Our soundtrack is Fighter by Ruby Bell, courtesy of Sugaroo Records. Happy OOUXing!